An argument tries to shut down and slam down the other point of view, that should give us all great concern. And so tonight we're very privileged to have an opportunity to hear some frank, straight talk about another point of view that you'll be able to take with you in your deliberations about the topic at hand. Now, we're going to have the speaker give his talk. It's going to be about 40-45 minutes. And then we're going to have a Q&A period. We're going to, Tom is working on getting a microphone stand for here. We've done this before so that we can kind of manage the eventualities. And we'll kind of a town hall thing where when the speaker says it's time for Q&A, we'll line up. Now, and then we'll be able to ask questions one at a time. But I just want to ask that because we have freedom of speech, does not mean that the microphone is time to give a free speech, right? It's time to ask the question and diligently listen to the answer. For those who want to give commentary, we'd ask you to refrain from that. Listen to the answers, listen to the questions, and give feedback on one of our discussion sites online or written feedback. In fact, I thought about this on the drive. If you want to write feedback, I'll make sure that it's posted on the Kitsap Patriot Tea Party website, the feedback, so that everybody can hear any feedback on the speech. So, are there any questions about how we're going to engage on that? Right? Civil speech, civil accountability. So that's how we're going to do that. And everybody knows that you don't have to raise your hand. You just scoot out the back. The bathrooms are around the corner. And if anything bad happens, the door is right there, right? So we don't have to worry about those things. So without further ado, this is a great night, and you're not here to listen to me speak. I'm turning this over to the president. Oh, not the president. The vice president to introduce our speaker, who has, by the way, been so, as far as I can tell, she is the one who made this whole thing happen and had a couple of our board members directly involved. But thank you very much for this. And
thank you to the Tea Party, because we've had such cooperation. It's made it a joy. Now, it's my privilege to introduce Dr. Don Easterbrook, who is Professor Emeritus at Western Washington University, and who does not toe the party line. You see those headlines, and tonight you are going to hear the real inconvenient truth. We have had so many lies told to us that I am just thrilled to have the truth come out tonight. Dr. Easterbrook.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. My voice is a little husky, and I suffer from allergies, so my voice is a little coarser than normal. You may have seen these headlines. As a matter of fact, I understand that something similar to this occurred in the local paper in the past few days or so. What you're seeing here made headlines all over the country and also elsewhere. And so I thought I would start by looking at what is being said in the news media and whether or not you can believe it. So the critical issue here is, I've underlined in red, April was the warmest ever recorded, and 2016 is 99% certain to follow suit, meaning the warmest year ever. Emphasize the word ever here. And then the rest talks about the month of April, which was indeed a warm month, but not the most. Fortunately, there's a solution for all of this heat. And that solution was been proposed by a meeting in Paris in December, the World Climate Conference. And it lasted for 11 days. It had 150 to 200 countries. About 40,000 people attended. And the cost was estimated to be about $1 billion. And you can read for yourself Obama's comments at this particular conference. And at the end, there was a document which, in fact, he signed, but not submitted to the Senate for ratification, so it doesn't have treaty strength. As a matter of fact, it doesn't have any power at all. But here's what's in what came out of the Paris conference. And you probably didn't hear much about this. This is their solution to all the heat, presumably, that's being generated, if you believe the headlines. Eliminate all capitalistic governments. This has been said by the top UN official, that climate change is not about science, it's about global social climate change, or global social change in government. Remove all national boundaries, no sovereign nations anymore. The U.S. wouldn't be a country, it would be just part of a global organization. Establish a global socialistic government run by the UN with no elections or accountability. Funded by the U.S. at $200 billion and other developed countries, which is to be paid into the bank deposit of the UN with no restrictions at all on how they spend it. Reduction of CO2 emissions to former low levels by elimination of all fossil fuels, power plants, autos, and so on, and massive subsidies for solar and for wind power. Establishment of carbon footprints for individuals and companies to be monitored by local governments. This means that each of you would have a carbon footprint and you would be allowed to emit so much carbon, and when you got to the end of your allotted amount, then you're done. Switching from power on demand to switch to power when it's available. So these are the kind of things that are involved in that particular document. But let's take a look and see if indeed these claims about the hottest April ever, the hottest year ever, are in fact true. I used to believe in apple pie and motherhood and Noah and NASA. These were all the things that were pure and good. Now I just believe in apple pie and motherhood, and I'll show you why. There's been massive fraudulent corruption of data by NOAA and by NASA, and I'll show you the data. You can judge for yourself. On the upper right-hand corner here, there is a graph. Oops, I get this to work. And there was warming from the early part of the century to about 1945, sharp cooling, and then warming again, and now in the last 15 years, cooling again. So what about those claims of the warmest year ever? The warmest year ever is here, but it's still less than it was in the 1930s. So these are not the warmest years ever. These are the warmest years since the 1930s. Completely different thing. The other thing that's important here is to realize the difference between weather and climate. They're not the same things. A hot day doesn't prove anything. A hot year doesn't prove anything. Even if the claims were true that 2014, 15, and so on were the hottest years recorded, it wouldn't mean anything, because you can have record-breaking heat waves in a cold period, or you can have record-breaking cold periods in an overall warming period. So it's important to distinguish between weather and climate. Weather is day-to-day fluctuations in the atmospheric processes. Climate is a long-term effect of weather over 15 years or so, something like that. They're not the same thing. So every day you'll read in the newspaper, gosh, it was the hottest day ever recorded in Timbuktu, and that proves global warming is here, and that's the cause. Baloney. It doesn't mean anything. So, how do you find the truth? You find the truth by looking at the data. I'm a data guy. I won't tell you what I think. I'll show you the data and you can decide for yourself. And not that simple. I mean, it's not that difficult to do. Did any of you see Climate Hustle, the movie at Poulsbo? Oh, wow. Good. If you haven't seen this, when it comes around again, I would really recommend you see it. Because it has the truth about what's going on, what the government is doing, and what the international UN group is trying to do. And it's also hilariously entertaining. It is really an entertaining and funny movie. So when it comes around again, and it will be out in CDs in a couple of months. So what do you need to know about global warming to be able to judge what you're seeing in the news? Well, first of all, global warming isn't used very much anymore because it didn't work out that the climate was warming. And so the people who were pushing CO2 said, well, we better call it climate change, which they did. And that didn't work out too well, so they changed it to climate disruption. And that didn't work out too well, so they went to extreme weather as being caused by some kind of climate trend. And then finally, ocean acidification came into the forefront. So what I like to talk about is facts, friction, and fraud, because all three of those things are present in what you're seeing and hearing in the news. So I'll spend a little bit of time telling you what the news media isn't telling you, which is a lot. Whatever happened to global warming, the corruption of NOAA and NASA as revealed by emails that came out in a scandal called ClimateGate, and that's really illuminating. And finally, perhaps most important, what's in store for the next 30 years? Should you throw away your parkas, or should you buy extras? And then finally, toward the end, or maybe in the question period, we talk about what's it really all about. So here are some truths that you may not have heard. The hottest year ever recorded claims, 2014, 2015, 2016, are unequivocally false. Those are lies, and I'll show you the data to prove it. No global warming has occurred in the past 18 years and about 9 months. You can show this with data from satellites. The surface data has been badly corrupted and altered by NOAA and NASA, but the satellite data can't be corrupted because there's no way to corrupt it. Something you probably weren't aware of, that we've had global cooling for the past 15 years. So when you hear that global warming is accelerating and the polar ice caps are melting at an ever-increasing rate, it's a lie. It's not true, and I'll show you the data. NOAA, which is the main keeper of records in the U.S., and NASA, which also has its own database, and Hadley, which is the English equivalent of NOAA, fraudulently tamper with data to make it look warmer than unaltered data indicate. And again, you don't have to take my word for it. I'll show you the data and you can see for yourself. Polar ice, especially Antarctic ice, is increasing. It's not melting. There were headlines in every newspaper in the world, I swear, last year claiming that the Antarctic ice sheet was going to essentially slip into the ocean, and we were going to have sea level changes of about 10 feet in a very short period of time, and maybe as much as 30 feet. Something you're probably also not aware of is that we have a geologic record of what's happened in the past, which is very instructive, because the past is really the key to the future. How can we know what's going to happen if we don't know what has happened before, if we don't know what's possible? So I'll show you some geologic records of past climate changes, especially some that have nothing to do with carbon dioxide, and we'll see that about 3 to 4 degrees temperature, Fahrenheit warmer, climates occurred during the past 10,000 years. Most of the past 10,000 years have been 3 to 4 degrees warmer than it is now. There's nothing new. So, global warming is real. The problem is it's not being caused by humans. And we'll have a chance to look at that. There's something else you may not be aware of. CO2 is not capable of creating significant global warming by itself. That's a bombshell, isn't it? For all the claims you see. And what I can tell you is that if you look at the atomic structure of a carbon dioxide molecule, it has a couple of receptive bands that will indeed absorb heat. But what you don't know is that there's so little CO2 in the atmosphere that it doesn't make any difference. Sea level has been constant at about 7 inches per century since 1850. There was a report that just came out of the National Academy of Sciences that said that cities should prepare seawalls around all of our major cities to expect 10 to 30 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century. So the idea is to make all of our coastal cities, walled cities, something like Holland, keep out the sea. We'll see how true that is. Extreme weather events are declining. They're lowest in 10 years. But what you hear every day on TV is that these extreme events, hurricanes, tornadoes, whatever, are increasing. The truth is they're not. The IPCC climate models, which form the basis for virtually all of the predictions made by the UN panel on climate, have failed miserably. There are 102 computer model runs. None of them were even close. They are a miserable failure, and yet this is the basis for most of what you're hearing in the news. Global climate is predicted to cool, not warm, on the basis of what the sun is doing. And I'll talk a little bit about that. And in fact, we've had global cooling for 15 years, and it's deepening, and probably going to be as deep as it was about 200 years ago during the Little Ice Age. And finally, the oceans are alkaline, they're not acid. So you hear, let's talk about ocean acidification, it's utter nonsense. The ocean's not acid, it's alkaline. So let's start by talking just for a little bit about the scientific method. And I need to do this so that you understand the difference between what I'm saying and what you're hearing from the CO2 people. There's a different basis. The scientific method, in general, works like this. You come up with a hypothesis, and then you test it, experiment with it, and if it disagrees, if the experiment disagrees with your hypothesis, then it's wrong, period. And as Richard Feynman, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist from Caltech, says, it doesn't make any difference how beautiful your guess is, how beautiful your hypothesis is, make any difference how smart you are, who made the guess, what his name is. If it disagrees with an experiment, it's wrong, and you have to throw it out. Oops. So we can look to Richard Feynman and as a matter of fact, Einstein, for some guidance about the scientific method. And this is what's, whoops. I think I just stepped on my plug here.
Do is to, everybody in an organization has somebody who has to ask the question about money, right? And I'm that one. So presuming that this is going to go off in a hitch here shortly, we do have some reasonable overhead for tonight's special meeting. And there should be, even though it says Kitsap Patriot Tea Party on it, I want you to know that every dollar that's given tonight will go first to pay the overhead of this meeting, and then split evenly between the organizations as our boards mutually agree. And so I counted, this is, by the way, a great meeting. We have 80 people here. Isn't that a good turnout? Yeah? Good turnout? And it's up. And so I'll remind you again at the end of the meeting. And so if each one of you could generously just give $10 tonight, that's going to take care of the whole boot. So back to our speaker. Let's give him a round of applause.
I've been doing lectures like this for 100 years, and this has never happened before. So this is the first. Okay, so let me go back here a bit. Now I'm going to go this way. No, going the wrong way, sorry. I'll get the hang of this yet. Okay. Now we're getting there. Are skeptics. It's important to doubt in order to test concepts. Computer models really don't prove anything. On the other hand, the basis for much of what you're seeing as in terms of climate science is based entirely on computer models that have proven to be highly inaccurate, not on the scientific method. Garbage in, garbage out. And I can tell you, I'll show you, most of the stuff that comes out is garbage. Here is a quote from one of the more important IPCC officials. This is the UN agency. And this is a statement he made. Proof is for mathematical theorems, and alcoholic beverages is not for science. How do you like that one? This is what they're basing on. And the idea is, and this is what they follow, science is all about credible theories and best explanations. You don't need proof when you have a following. So all true scientists are skeptics. So when you hear people say, oh, you're a skeptic with kind of a sneer, that means you're probably a scientist. If you're not a skeptic, you're not a scientist. And everything ultimately, of course, is going to depend on evidence. So what I will show you tonight is evidence, and you can decide for yourself what to do. Probably the most overused phrase you'll see in the news media is 97% of all scientists believe that CO2 causes catastrophic global warming. How many times have you heard that? The President's still saying it. EPA saying it. I read it every day. So there are a couple of things to consider here. First of all, you see the cartoon. The consensus that the Earth is definitely flat. Well, there is also a difference between something you believe and something that you can prove. And consensus really doesn't mean anything at all. Albert Einstein has some great philosophical sayings and thoughts about this. When he first came out with this theory of relativity in the 1920s, he got a lot of criticism. It really shook the physics world. And so they put together a committee of 100 of the most prestigious physicists in the world to disprove him. And so they asked him what he thought about that. And he said, I don't know why they need 100, it only takes one. So therein lies the difference between the scientific method and consensus. Also, science is never settled. Every day you'll hear about attempts to muzzle people like me especially. And anytime you see this, you know that probably because they're losing the scientific argument, they have to say, oh, well, we don't need to talk about it because it's all settled. Well, the 97% consensus claim isn't true, because here is what lies behind it. There was a master's thesis by some people, I think in Indiana. This is the student. Sent out 10,000 questionnaires, got 3,000 back, and from this 3,000, they hand-selected 77, and lo and behold, 75 of those 77 said, yeah, CO2 is causing catastrophic climate change. And that's 97%. But it's 75 out of 3,000, not out of 77, because these were hand-picked. There was also another attempt made to look at all published scientific papers dealt with climate. And so people went back and checked on this, went back through 11,000, almost 12,000 papers. Took a lot of work. And only 64 of those actually said warming since 1950 was man-made, which is 0.5%, not 97%. So when you hear the 97%, remember where it comes from. And something else you probably don't know is that there are 31,487 scientists who have degrees in one of the sciences, 9,000 with PhD, who have signed, literally, this statement that says that CO2 is not causing global warming. If, as claimed, all 97% of scientists agree that CO2 is causing global, that would mean that with this many who don't believe it, you'd have to have 1 million who did believe it. And, of course, that isn't happening. Add to that some revelations that came out a number of years ago in emails that were released to the public from various members of the CO2 climate community, including Tom Wigley and Phil Jones, who was the director of the Hadley Center, which is a big thing, like being the director of NOAA in England. And this is what Wrigley said. If we could reduce the ocean blip, this would be significant for the global mean, but we still have to explain the blip. It would be good to remove at least part of the 1940s blip, but we're still left with one blip. This is really revealing, because what it means is they deliberately set out to alter the climate record so that it wouldn't show this climate change that occurred during the middle part of the last century. In the 1970s, we were starting to experience, actually we were well into, a cooling period. The climate had warmed from the turn of the century up to about 1940 something, and then look at this drop in the average temperature. Significant cooling. Here is the cooling that occurred after they removed the blip. This was done deliberately, fraudulently. They took this cooling, and here it is from here to here. It's essentially gone. If you don't like what the climate is doing, you just erase it. So, documents like this are an impediment to free exercise of thought, and it doesn't get you anywhere. Conclusions that are based on preconceived ideas are valueless. It's only the open mind that really thinks. So I would invite you to keep an open mind about everything I say, question anything I say, and look at the evidence and decide for yourself. So let's look at these hottest year ever claims that you see every day. Here's one from the New York Times. 2014 breaks the heat record, challenging global warming skeptic, hottest on Earth. This record keeping began in 1880. So, gee, that's pretty impressive, doesn't it? Then 2015, it was even hotter, hottest year so far. And now we're faced with the idea that 2016 is supposed to break that record. So let's look at how we can check to see if that claim is true. The best check that we have is from satellite temperature measurements, because these cannot be corrupted. And there are two satellites, and they both, the data from both of them confirm each other. And these have been, in fact, confirmed by weather balloons that go up to where the satellite is measuring the temperature. So we have verification of this curve over here, on the right-hand side, this curve right here, from two satellites which say the same thing, and weather balloons which confirm both of them. So we know it's real. Well, here's 2014 and 15. If this was the hottest year ever, what's it doing over here with all these stuff that's above that? And you can point to, I counted, I think, 16 peaks of warming, of temperature, that were greater than 2014 and 2015. And that's only since 1979, when the first satellite records were kept. So how do they make these claims? Here's what they do. Here are the satellite measurements going back to about 2000 or so. And you can see there's clearly a cooling trend. And so what NASA did, they bumped this from here clear up to here and said, oh, it's not cooling, it's warming. How did they do that? Well, how they do it is they make up data and they change data. This is a temperature chart of the world. Everything you see in gray, there are no records. Look at the amount of the Earth for which there are no temperature records. And so what NOAA and NASA do, for one thing, is they take an area like the Arctic, say, well, we've got a temperature here and a temperature over here. We'll just extrapolate that over the whole region. And of course, it's going to make it warmer. The same is true in Africa and in South America. And they also assign temperatures over a large area where there's no data at all. They make it up. And so they don't really represent any real temperatures. And here is the proof of that. This is from their own data. This is not from some outside source. This is a data source of NOAA, which is the cleanest data there is. It's all rural data, where you don't have a lot of urban heating going on. And this is the number of, and the amount of data, the percentage of data put out by NOAA for which there are no temperature stations. And we were going along very nicely until about 2010, and all of a sudden now it bumps up to 50%, which is to say that 50% of all of the NOAA data is made up. It does not exist as a real temperature measurement. And we see another piece of evidence for that. We can look at the satellite record. This is the satellite record. It's not a surface temperature record. And we can go back to about 1996 and draw a straight line, and we're exactly, this is a 0 increase in temperature. The satellites prove there has been no global warming for 18 years and 9 months. Doesn't that blow you away? No warming. And yet every day you hear accelerating temperatures. We're all going to toast. So how do they do that? Here's what we can start with. This is the unaltered record before NOAA and NASA got their hands on it. And it's interesting to note here that look at the 1930s and 40s, for example. Look how hot it was. And look where it is lately. The truth is, it was hotter in the 1930s than it is now. Than it is in the last 20 years here. So NOAA, NASA, and Hadley, they're cooking the books, literally. And this is the way they do it. This is the amount of temperature change which they have introduced into the measured data. And so what they do is they say, if we put a thermometer on the table here and measure it, we get a number. What they will do is say, oh, well, that's not quite right because it was actually warmer in Seattle and Vancouver, so we're going to increase the temperature here as the official reading for the temperature here. And so what they do is they artificially add temperature to recent temperatures and subtract it from others, so they change what is a cooling trend into a warming trend. That's the way they fabricate the data. And here's the proof. These are the number of record daily high temperatures over the last 80 years, and look at the 1930s. 1936 was the hottest year ever by far. Recent ones are not even close to it. And here's where we are now. So which was hotter, the 1930s or recently? And here are the records. 1936, there were almost 10,000 records broken. And if you add these up, look at all, these are all in the 1930s. Top 10 were mostly in the 1930s. The total number of records, 62,000 in the 1930s and only 24,000 in the past couple of decades. In other words, 3 times as many records were broken in the 1930s. And so we've had cooling from 1945 to 1977. We saw a minute ago. Here's that cooling trend. And this is verification of it by recent data in more recent years. And this is what they changed. It used to come down like this. NOAA just erased it. You don't like the record? Change it. Simple as that. So what records can you believe? You can't believe NOAA and NASA and the English Hadley. Who can you believe? Well, you can believe the unaltered temperature, the basic readings that have not been tampered or corrupted, and we have some of those. So again, look here. These are the 1930s. Warm is up. Red means warm. And look where we are now relative to where we were in the 1930s. So you can believe the non-tampered data. You can also look at a number of other things. For example, here are the number of record daily high temperatures that we just looked at. You can believe that because they can't change a record. They can change the temperature reading, but if the hottest day was 100 degrees, they can't say, oh, well, it was really 110. And here is the satellite data. So the satellite data is indeed unassailable, really. It's really the gold standard. So what this tells us is that for the last 15 years, the temperature trend has actually been cooling, not warming. This is a slight downward trend here. A couple years ago, it snowed in Florida. A couple years ago, these were the areas that were cooler than normal as opposed to the average. Winter temperatures have been going down. These are decadal changes in winter temperatures for the U.S. -8, -8. Mostly in the interior. Cooling is going on. So What this means is that all those records for global warming don't mean anything because they're not true. Another local situation occurred recently when there was a Seattle Times headline that says melting glaciers in the Northwest were disastrous. And the North Cascades could lose 5 to 10% of their volume this year alone. And the glaciers are smaller than they've been in the last 4,000 years as a result of all the heating that's going on. Well, I just finished writing a book about glaciers on Mount Baker. And so I know these glaciers very well. They're old friends. But that doesn't sound right. So the glacier they were looking at primarily was the Sholes Glacier. This is what it looked like in 1947. This is what it looked like in 2009. I challenge you to see any difference. It's not melting. Here are the comparison of the two. In 1952, the green line here shows you where the ice margin was. Blue line is 2014. If anything, it's a little more extensive now than it was in 1952. So this isn't the lowest it's been in 4,000 years. It is actually grown a little bit. Other glaciers on Mount Baker show the same thing. Here's the glacier terminus in 1952, about a kilometer up valley from where it was in 2014. Here's the Mazama Glacier, same thing. Here's where it was in 2014. Here's where it was in 1952. Glaciers were way up valley in 1952. So how could the present be so warm, the glaciers disappearing so fast, that they're a mile down valley from where they were in 1952? And it was a number of other examples of that, which I'm going to skip through. And interestingly enough, some recent photographs taken of the Roosevelt Glacier on Mount Baker show right here at this line right here, a bare rock face right here. Here the glaciers advanced over it. And glaciers are actually advancing. They're not the lowest they've been in the last 4,000 years. So what I did was I sent this information, this data, to the Seattle Times and to the Bellingham Herald. And that the person who did this, Murray Pelto, that his conclusions were totally fraudulent. And so I suggested that they either publish the data I had sent them or retract this story. Neither one of them would do it. So here's an old saying: if an honest person is proven wrong, he or she can either stop being wrong or stop being honest. And so we know what the New York Times and the Bellingham Herald are. Let's look very quickly at the situation in the polar ice caps. Okay, every day you hear the polar ice caps are melting at an accelerating rate. Here's Antarctica. It has two big glaciers. The biggest by far, 95% or so of the ice is in the East Antarctic ice sheet here, and there's a smaller one over here which has about 8% of the volume of the ice. At the North Pole, this is Gore's statement. He said that the North Pole ice cap is 40% gone. Well, one ice cap, there's no ice cap at the North Pole. He didn't even know that, apparently. And it will be completely, totally gone the next 5 to 10 years. This was in 2009. Should be all gone by now. And of course, this has an effect on the polar bears. So if you look at the temperatures, if you look at the ice in the Antarctic, the average annual temperature is minus 58 degrees Fahrenheit, 58 degrees below Fahrenheit. So in order to melt that, what do you got to do? You got to bring it back up to 32, don't you? So you'd have to heat the Antarctic ice cap 58 degrees plus 32 plus another 10 degrees to get any melting. You'd have to raise the temperature of the Antarctic ice sheet 100 degrees to get it to melt. Not going to happen. And in fact, sea ice in the Antarctic is at an all-time high. Right now, it's the red, if I can get this to work, this is the red curve up here. And the seas around them are also cooling. So here we have data that show the two satellite here and here, two satellites. This is another temperature, ground temperature. This is the temperature at the South Pole. Sure looks like a lot of warming, doesn't it? There is zero warming in 37 years in the South Pole. And yet they continue to claim that it is melting at around. How about the poor polar bears? Poor polar bears. Well, they're doing just fine. the polar bear population has gone from about 5,000 in the 1970s to, I don't know, somewhere around 25,000 or thereabouts. And what we know is that the volume of Arctic sea ice since 2012 has been increasing, not decreasing. Here's where it was in 1979, here's where it was in 2010. There's a little bit of loss right here, but other than that, it's pretty much the same as it was in 79. It's been warmer in the Arctic in the 1930s than in the past couple of decades. So how can we be losing ice in the Arctic if the temperatures were warmer here than they are now? In other words, the Arctic is not warming at an the greatest ever, whatever. Here is a summary of all stations in the Arctic, mostly in Iceland and in Greenland and Russia. Here's the high area in the 1930s and 40s, and this is where we are now, and it's lower than it was in 1930. It shows the same thing here, 1920, 1940, here's what the temperatures were, and now we're getting close, but we're not there yet. We're not as warm as it was. So there's nothing unusual going on in the Arctic, is the bottom line here. They've actually cooled a bit. But here's one that should blow you away. Here's the temperature record for the last 10,000 years as derived from isotope measurements in the Greenland ice core. Red is warm, and this is temperature over here. For the past 10,000 years, the temperatures were 3 to 4 degrees warmer than present until about 1500, until about a year when it turned cold. It has been 3 to 4 degrees warmer for almost all of the past 10,000 years than it is now. There's no doubt about it. And the 3 to 4 degrees, I should say, is in Greenland. That doesn't mean at the Arctic. Well, how about CO2? Let's take a quick look at CO2 and see how it acts as a greenhouse gas. How much CO2 do you suppose is in this awful spew? That's all water vapor. There might be a few thousandths of 1% in CO2, but not much. CO2 is rising, no doubt about it. And normal is about down here. This is where we would expect it to be most of the time. And it's risen up to here. How much is that? Well, we started at 31 thousandths of 1% of CO2 in the atmosphere, and we've gone to 41 thousandths of percent, where we are now. So what does that mean? It means if you double nothing, you still have nothing, don't you? Right? So this doesn't matter because there's so little CO2 that it isn't going to do anything. It's like telling a flea on an elephant's back, trying to tell the elephant where to go. We have as much influence on CO2 in the climate as the flea has on an elephant's back. And here's why. The atmospheric content of CO2 right now is 4 1,000ths of 1%. That's that first number here. Oops, here we go. Since 1950s, which is the only time you could possibly attribute anything to CO2, it increased by 8 1,000ths of 1%. That's going to change a lot, isn't it? And on top of that, CO2 is responsible for only about 3.5% of the total greenhouse effect. 95% of the greenhouse effect is by water vapor. Nothing to do with CO2. And water vapor has not increased in the past century. So what this shows us is that there's absolutely no correlation between carbon dioxide rising here and temperature. Here in the 1960s, CO2 was rising and the temperature was cooling. And here, the temperature rose without any change in CO2. So CO2 is not doing anything. And we know that CO2 doesn't drive the climate because we have records that go back thousands of years in the ice core. This is the curve that showed temperature rising into an interglacial, cooling off to a glacial, rising to interglacial. And this is the CO2 content of air trapped in ice bubbles. And notice that the CO2 content lags the temperature. Al Gore claims that the CO2 is causing the warming of the interglacials. How can CO2 possibly do that when it follows the temperature? In order for this to be true, CO2 should be over here. In other words, the ice cores prove that CO2 always lags temperature. Temperature drives CO2, not the other way around. In terms of the total amount, here's the last 250 million years. Here's where we are now down here. And here's where we've been for most of the last 250 million years. And look at how it has cooled, and CO2 has gone down over about the last 65,000 to maybe 140,000 years to where we are now. So we are in an abnormally low period of CO2, not high. For almost all of the last 250 million years, CO2 has been about 5 times as much as it is now. And life flourished. Everything was hunky-dory. Here's another interesting thing. If you look at where the present level is right here, at this level right here, there's not enough CO2 to support plant life. If all plant life dies, what happens to the rest of us? And we're gone too. Look how close we are. We're dangerously close to being in real trouble down here. How about sea level? Quick comment about this. Here are some reconstructions. This is New York City. I actually kind of like it. I'm not a big fan of New York City. Here's Washington, D.C. I like this one even better. Here's Boston, and all the blue is supposed to be underwater. And here is a scenario that suggests that we're going to have big storm surges and rising sea level that's going to engulf everything. National Geographic a couple of years ago produced this map, which was their sea level projection. It looks like we're going to lose all the Florida, so we don't have to worry about electoral votes in Florida. It's going to be underwater. The entire East Coast is going to be underwater. We're going to lose New York and Boston, all of that. Look at Europe. We're going to lose all of this area in Europe, including a big area in the Arctic, big areas over here in the eastern part of Europe. So this is their projection. Here's some local projections. This is Seattle. Here is the dock area. You know, they unload all the ships downtown. Here's what is projected. All of that's projected to be underwater. In this case, I think it's either 2060 or 2100. I don't remember which it is. Here is Skagit County. Here is Highway 20 that connects Mount Vernon with Anacortes. That's going to be all underwater. You have to have a bridge that's, I don't know, probably 10, 15 miles long. Chuckanut Drive is underwater. This whole area is supposed to be submerged by only a 6 feet increase in sea level. Here's up by Bellingham. This is all projected to be underwater. And these projections are put out as real. You can pull these up online and you can look at them yourself. And you can change the amount of sea level and see what is going to be inundated. And the National Academy of Sciences says 10 to 20 feet by the end of the century. 10 to 20 feet is going to submerge most of the coastal cities of the world. And they figure they will displace 42 million people. So not an inconsequential thing. So the National Academy is suggesting that we start building walls around our city that are 10 to 30 feet high to keep the sea level from rising. So how credible are these estimates? Well, let's look locally. This is sea level rise, generally a global sea level rise as compiled by people in the University of Colorado. It's rising at about 7 inches per century. It's been doing that since 1850. Here's Seattle. Look how, this goes back 100 years, and look how even that is. It's not accelerating. And look at the amount. 6.5 inches by 2100. That means if you're 50 years old, you're going to experience a whopping sea level rise of about 3.5 inches. So I don't think if you're counting on having waterfront property back away from the shoreline that you better count on that. It's not going to happen. And here's what it would take. Here is this sea level change. The global sea level change is amazingly constant at 7 inches a century. This is what it would take to cause the sea level to rise about 6 feet. You'd have to have an incredible increase in the rise of sea level. Neah Bay is actually emerging. It's not submerging, it's emerging. Sea level is going down at Neah Bay, not up. So the interesting thing that came out of some of the statements from various government agencies is the hotter it gets, the colder it's going to be. If you wrap yourself around that one, you'll understand. This was actually said by one of the aides from Gore. Actually said this. There also is a claim that frequency of severe weather events is decreasing. The claim is that it's increasing, and that this causes then the idea that global warming is causing these things. So let's take a look at these. Hurricanes going down since 1994. Incidence of hurricanes. This is in hurricane energy. Here's a tornado trend. Here we were last year, way down here. Doesn't look like a big increase here, does it? Here is the correlation between severe tornadoes and atmospheric CO2 is actually decreasing. The New York Times and various other news agencies have said that the end of snow is imminent. Since 1990, they've been predicting the end of snow. Winter sports are doomed. Snow will be so rare that the next generation won't know what snow is. Snowfall is a thing of the past. And when you look at that, here is the truth. 5 of the 6 snowiest years have occurred since 2004. This is global. So I don't think you have to worry about snow. If you're skiers, don't worry. It's getting snowier, not less snowy. Droughts, the same sort of thing. Big headlines about droughts in California, droughts in Texas, droughts everywhere. Droughts typically last about 2 or 3 years and then they're done. Actually, droughts in the past roughly 100 years have become shorter, less frequent, less severe, and cover small areas. And there's the data. So what's in store for the next 30 years? And I'm going to whip through this in a hurry, and then we'll take a break. What's happening? There are 2 ways to approach this whole question. One is by using computer models, which is what the UN does, what all of the CO2 people depend on, the computer models. Or you can look at real physical evidence to establish cyclical patterns, what's happened in the past. The past is the key to the future. Well, how good are the computer models of the UN? Here is the average of 102 computer runs for predicting the temperature from about roughly 1996 or so through 2025. This is their prediction from their computer. This is what has actually been happening. This is the real world. This is based on real physical data, real physical measurements. And look at the difference. And the gap is widening. The computer models upon which all of this hoax is predicated are worthless. They're not even close. They're predicting 1 degree temperature rise every decade. And it's nowhere close. It's actually been cooling. It's been the reverse of that. So we can then look at the past. What's been happening in the past? Oh, here's the computer. These are all 102 computer models. This is how far off, how far wrong they are, and it's big. So we can determine ancient temperatures by looking at historic measurements, isotope measurements, glacier fluctuations, fossils, isotope measurements, fossils, and so on, trimmings. So we can determine what's been going on in the past pretty well. And here's what's been going on in the recent past. It was warmer from 1915 to 1950 roughly, cooled from about 1950 to 1980, warm from 1980 until about 2000, and since then it's been cooling. What about the last 500 years? What's it been doing? Warm, cold, warm, cold, warm, cold, warm, cold, warm, cold. Every 27 years, it changes from warm to cold. For 500 years, 40 different changes with no change in CO2. That should tell you something. So, we can look at warm and cool periods. The red here is warm for the past 5,000 years. It's warmer. About 1,500 years, it started to cool off, the blue area here. And the same thing is true in the Greenland ice core. So how can we use the past to predict the future? And this is the way we do it. A number of years ago, I was sitting at my computer at 3 in the morning looking at curves of the glacier advance and glacier retreat on Mount Baker. And I happened to come across a paper which showed the change in temperatures of the Pacific Ocean waters just offshore. I thought, boy, that looks familiar. Look at this. The glaciers advance when the North Pacific Ocean water cools, and the glaciers retreat when the Pacific gets warmer. And so globally, the same thing happens. Cool for the period from 1950 to roughly 1980, and then warming for about 20 years, and then cooling again. So this is called the PDO. It's the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. I'll try to remember that. What it means is the temperature of the ocean water just off the Washington coast. Red is warm, blue is cold. So the Pacific Ocean was colder during the time that the climate was colder and the glaciers advanced, and when the Pacific was warmer, the glaciers retreated and global temperatures were warmer. So what we can do then is to look at the pattern: warm, cool, cool. And during a cold mode, there's cold water off the coast of North America. During the warm mode of the Pacific Ocean, there's warm water there. And the difference shows up in the temperature of the water and what happens to the global climate. So what I did was I said, okay, here are 40 changes: warm, cold, every 30 years, changes from warm to cold and back. Here's the index of the Pacific Ocean. I said, okay, what if we project where we were back here into the future? Here's 2020, here 2030. We should be experiencing a cooling. And so I made a prediction in 1999, which is a year after, at that point, the hottest year since the 1930s, that we were headed for 30 years of global cooling. People thought I was crazy. And they might be right, but the question is how good was the prediction? So this is what I predicted. One of these scenarios here, the temperature was going to cool from 2000 to 2040, something like that. Here's what the UN predicted. It was going to get hotter now. And so I took the temperature record, warm from 1915 to 1950, cold from 1950 to 1980, even though they tried to erase it. And I flipped this forward and grafted it on to take us to 2040. In other words, this is a repeating pattern that keeps going on over and over and over again. And so if we just predict the cycle, predict it into the future, that's what you get. You get these curves right here. And this is what I said in 2000, and essentially I said the current warm cycle is over, and we're headed into cooler climates. So how cold will it get? And the answer is we don't really know, but we could get some idea of where we're heading. If we look at the temperatures from the cool period from 1945 to 77, it looks like this. Downward here means colder. And so 1880, 1950 was a cool period. It was colder than in the 1970s. 200 years ago, and about the year 1800, it was even colder. And in 1650 to 1700, it got really cold, and this was a disaster. This was the beginning of the Little Ice Age, where about a third of the population of Europe perished from cold and disease and starvation and that sort of thing. So the question is, which one of these are we headed for? And we know we're headed there because the sun is in a big funk. And it is repeating the same pattern that occurred here during the Dalton cold period of the Little Ice Age at about 1800. And there is a 200-year solar cycle that repeats over and over again. So the sun is heading into a cool period. And so now the question is, how good was my prediction in 2000? It's kind of like my plan for living forever. So far, so good. It's cooling. It's been cooling for the past 15 years. And global cooling is a far greater threat than global warming. You kill 10 to 20 times as many people with global cooling as you do with global warming. Measurements versus what they predicted.
Oh, I understand, but I'm saying I should be able to dry run my computer model by looking backward over 500, 1,000, or 2,000 years. Is that a valid way of testing the model? I think it should. Could it be valid without testing back 2,000 years?
Okay.
Because how do we explain the normal variations of these huge swings? And if they can explain them, then they understand the science of global climate change. And if they can't explain those swings, they can't begin to start predicting what's happening in the future because they can't explain what happened in the past.
Sure. So my question would be, if you can't predict, in this case from about 1995 to 2013, how good is your projection going to be back thousands of years? It's going to be worthless. If you can't do recent history, you can't do ancient history.
Okay, for those who want to ask questions, if we just kind of line up here, please. And when we do ask a question, please give us your name, and then we can ask the question briefly.
John Holmberg here. Have you been able to convince your peers out the UW of your theories here? They seem to be going the other way.
Well, what I can tell you is that there is a very strong CO2 group at the UW, primarily in oceanography and some in meteorology. There is also another group, which is just the opposite, who look at the data, and I look at data about 3 or 4 times a week. They're put out by a UW group, which is exactly counter to what the pro-CO2 people are saying. So the answer to the question is there are both sides there.
When are they going to be shut down?
Joan Benzie. I certainly believe everything you're saying.
Could I interrupt you, sir? You don't need to believe anything I said. Look at the data and you can see for yourself. Okay, I just want to make that clear. Don't believe it because I said it.
What puzzles me, and I find it just almost unbelievable, is the overwhelming amount of people that fall for this garbage. Is it money? Is it power? What is it?
I'm glad you asked that question. What's it really all about?
Yeah.
About money and power, and is the short answer. And the money is huge. The estimates are made that something like $1 trillion a year is wasted on the global climate hoax. In the university systems, I can tell you from my own personal experience that if you sign on to the CO2 dogma, that the money is endless. You can have $1 million grants. You're assured of tenure. You're assured of promotion. I'll just sign on to the dogma. If you don't, then you will be essentially banished. At Washington University, because I show data like this, and because I testified to a Senate committee and showed them the data, I no longer am allowed to ask questions at master's thesis defenses. I'm no longer allowed to speak in the departmental seminars. If I have a guest speaker, they don't advertise it to the rest of the academic community, and on and on and on and on. In other words, there is a fundamental assault on the First Amendment and free speech, at least in the universities that I know. It's disgusting, I know, I agree. I never thought I'd see this happen, but it is.
Yeah, if we don't bring the questions up front, they keep on falling to the back of the room. So come on.
Well, I had a similar question to hers, but so I have a comment. I've been really annoyed by this debate over the years, partly because I lived in Bangladesh for 12 years, which was often given as one of the big examples that was going to be most negatively affected by global warming. And so they started bringing in a lot of money, donor aid, to prevent the effects of global warming. The problem with that is all of the problems in Bangladesh, like saltwater intrusion and things, have nothing to do with global warming. It has all to do with environmental, man-made degradation and things like that. So they've actually made it so those issues are not being addressed. And I don't know, it's like They don't realize the negative impact of this discussion. I know. So, well, my question was, what's the rationale, and it's similar to hers. Why do people want to get into this argument?
I have some personal experience in those areas because of my good friend from Sweden has gone to the Maldives, which are used as the poster child for sea level rise. They want billions of dollars to relocate the entire population of the Maldive Islands to higher ground because they think it's sinking. The same is true in the Pacific Ocean. Same is true in Bangladesh. And my friend, who is the world's foremost sea level expert, has personally gone to all three of these areas. And what he has found was in the Maldives, the sea level was actually higher in 1979 than it is now. It's gone down about a meter. But the government refuses to recognize that, even though there's a shoreline that proves it, and with photos and the whole bit. The same is true in at least two of the island groups in the Pacific, and the same is true in Bangladesh. My friend just finished a study in Bangladesh, and what he found was that most of the submergence that's been taking place is due to settling of water-saturated sediment on the delta, which is normal.
My name is Bill Stump. Climate change is not the problem, it's the excuse. This is a desire by the UN and some people, liberals in our country, to control us. This is designed so that food production, growth, and development of humans are controlled by people who know better than we do. So it's not the climate, it's what you want to get out of it.
The whole climate issue began back in the late 1980s in Sweden. And it was set up with the idea of pushing CO2 as a basis for making social change. And that's what it is. It is now clearly admitted by the highest level officials in the UN that the argument is not about science, it's about global socialistic government by the UN. That's the goal. And you can read for yourself. Go to the internet and look up Agenda 21 and read it. It'll make your hair stand on that. And so, yes, you're entirely correct.
Dr. Easterbrook, my name is Billie Jean Liedel, and thank you for being here tonight. We're a fairly small crowd, but I'm getting pretty peeved. So, here's my question. What's it really all about? But what's it going to take? What can we do to support, write letters? What can G.I. Joe do? Okay, that's my question. What can we do?
The answer to that is one word: vote. Vote the people out who are pushing climate change in order to institute a socialistic government, and that's what it's all about. There are two parts of this whole question, and one is money, and we're talking about $1 trillion a year, something like that. And so the amounts are huge, and the amount of personal gain. There are very few people who are pushing the UN agenda who aren't rich. They've gotten rich by using that. And so here's the Paris conference, and the idea is in that yellow print, which you know that you read. The whole idea. This was Christina Figueres is the highest-ranking UN secretary dealing with climate, aside from Moon, who is the Secretary General. And she says the goal is not to save the world from ecological destruction, but to destroy capitalism and install a global socialistic government. They're very clear what they want.
My name is Dan Dashner. I have a question about the numbers, the temperatures. You hear all the time here, the temperature at SeaTac. If you're in Phoenix, it's the temperature at Sky Harbor. Those are big concrete heat islands. Are the temperatures used for this based on those heat island temperatures? Because as soon as you get away from those areas, you drive away, 20 miles away, it's cooler. Right. So where are these temperatures taken from?
Let's go back a ways. In a nutshell, what's happening is that the cities, with all their concrete, are warming up at a faster rate than rural areas. And so back in the 1930s and 40s, most of the temperatures that were measured in rural areas where there's not a lot of concrete heating. And since then, as the cities have grown bigger and bigger, what's happened is that they get hotter and hotter. So you would think, wouldn't you, that you should subtract temperatures from modern and either leave the old ones alone or, if anything, make them cooler. And when you do that, what you end up with is this, that here's what they've added to recent temperatures, despite the heating of cities and concrete, and they subtracted temperatures in the 1930s and 40s when most of the temperatures measured were rural and need no heating correction. So this should be reduced. This should be down here, and this should be up here. They do just the opposite, and the net effect is to tilt a cooling trend into a warming trend. So you're absolutely right. The temperatures that you measure in the cities are artificially elevated by the concrete that's there. The other thing I can tell you is that 85% of the NOAA temperature recording stations are not sited properly. They're over barbecues, they're at the end of runways where they get hit by jet blast. They're in the middle of concrete parking lots. 85% of the data that I showed on the NOAA graphs are from stations that are no good. Now they have a second network, which is what I call the clean network. And that is stations that are rural, that don't have this heating effect. And if you look at those temperatures, you get a temperatures that look something like this. They're much different than what they are recording as the official temperature. So this is what they do. It's the process they call homogenization. So imagine a glass of absolutely pure water, distilled water, and then a glass of sludgy water. And so instead of using the clear, pure water as the basis for their measurements, whatever, they mix the two. And then they say, this is what the global temperature is. In other words, the homogenization is they mix the bad data with the good data, and that's what they plot.
My name is Mike Vineyard. Another question. Have you had a chance to take a look at the different reports, studies that were suggesting, like, for example, solar activity, cosmic rays, the effects there that may have on cloud formation, that, like the Maunder minimum being contributing to these temperature variations is a much more significant factor? I'm just curious, you're a geologist, but have you taken a look at these other studies and what's your comment on those? Because those seem a lot more credible because it fits the models a little bit better.
If you've got another hour, I can answer that question because
Just
what I do is I often lecture on the solar effect, and here we have it, and the relationship between solar magnetism and climate. And in a nutshell, this is the way it works. When there are low sunspots, the climate on Earth is cooler. Why is that? Well, nobody's been able to figure that out. The total change in the amount of infrared radiation is not that great. That doesn't explain it. So it's something else. And so apparently what happened, this was an experiment that was done at the CERN nuclear lab in Switzerland, where what they did was they accelerated particles through air, and this is what they found. When the solar magnetic field is low, that's our shield, then there's more incoming radiation that gets through there. Cosmic radiation, not heat, not infrared, but cosmic radiation. When that happens, that increased radiation ionizes. It means it becomes charged particles in the atmosphere that attract water vapor and condense into water droplets, which makes clouds. So when you get a reduction in the solar magnetic field, you get an increase in cosmic radiation, an increase in cloudiness, and a lot of the sun's energy is reflected. And the guy who did this was Henry Svezmark. It's a simple experiment that most high school students do in physics. The Wilson cloud chamber proves it. You can see it. Most of us did that in high school. And it seems to work. And now what I've done is I've looked at the composition of isotopes in the upper atmosphere, mostly radiocarbon and beryllium, as a measure of how much radiation is coming in, because the more radiation comes in, the more radiocarbon and the more beryllium is produced in the upper atmosphere. And we can measure that in ice cores and in various other ways to find out. And what we find out is there's an amazing correlation between the incidence of radiocarbon and beryllium, both isotopes, and temperature. It follows it, almost like they're dance partners. And so I'm convinced that that's the answer, that it has to do not with changes in the amount of sunlight or heat that the sun puts out, but in the changes in the magnetic field of the sun.
Dr. Easterbrook, so we know that IPCC or other organizations from the UN have been operating now for over 40 years. Back in the 70s, it was chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, and they were creating ozone holes over the Antarctic, and so they had to ban all the, refrigeration technology and force everything else. A lot of money, right? A lot of money. And then we saw them go into this whole global warming issue. When Michael Mann's information was finally exposed, I will. And so I'm leading up to this. So we've seen them go through this, it's kind of like the Wizard of Oz. Don't pay any attention to the guy behind the curtain. So when fraud was exposed with the global warming, then it became climate change. Now it's going to go into something else. So what they're doing right now is they're shutting down dissent because people are waking up to the fraud. Tell me what they're doing right now in terms of things like, what happens if you publish an opinion that is contrary? What happens, do you get funding for being able to actually investigate scientific issues of other forcings? And what's happening with lawsuits and things like that today?
Well, in my own case, what I can tell you is that if you don't sign on, your hope of getting any funding is hopeless. For about 40 years, all my research was funded by the National Science Foundation. And since I started publishing data, I don't publish my own opinions, really, I just publish data. I have essentially been shut out of NSF. The National Science Foundation has been taken over by CO2 people, and you cannot get a grant from the National Science Foundation unless you sign on to CO2. It gets even worse than that. The National Academy of Sciences, which used to be the most prestigious scientific organization in North America. Only the people who had made real, tangible contributions in science were admitted to the Academy. Now all you have to do is sign on to CO2 and you're in, and anybody who doesn't sign on doesn't stand a chance of getting in. In addition, I'm one step ahead of the law, apparently. The Attorney General of the state of Washington is one of a group of people who is pushing to have people like me arrested and put in jail using a sort of a peripheral law called RICO, which was designed to help in getting mafia people into jail. And some of the wording in that they have made into, well, if you are proposing something that is bad for society, you can be arrested. Well, gee, climate skeptics are saying, gee, we don't think there's a problem, and therefore, if the problem becomes catastrophic, it's our fault that nothing was done about it, therefore we should be arrested and thrown in jail. So this group, there's about 20 of them. Our Secretary General, our Attorney General is one of them. And so they're now kicked back from a committee in the House that is demanding of 12 Attorney Generals in 12 states that they turn over all of their emails to show this collusion of what they're trying to do. And apparently what they don't understand is the First Amendment. They used to have this archaic belief in the Constitution that freedom of speech is accorded to everybody. And they're saying, no, shut up, you can't say that.
Don Taylor. According to my three sons, I'm a denier. But my problem was I shouldn't have sent them to college. But anyway, I've been going to Alaska periodically with my son-in-law. He's been going there since he was like 9 years old. And I've noticed on Tracy,
back and forth, back and forth, and back and forth. And the truth of the matter is, as is shown by the Mount Baker glaciers, is the glaciers retreated farther up valley in the 1950s than they have by a mile than they have in the last warming period from 1980 to 2000. So no doubt about global warming. The glaciers go back and forth. They're like paleothermometers. They go back and forth. And the climate's always changing. Every 30 years it changes.
My question is, first of all, this has been very fascinating and very well researched. My problem is, I guess, because this is totally out of my field, I have always thought of dryness as warm. And I know a lot of states that that are dry, they probably would be the same, my relatives would feel the same way I did. Give me a simplistic answer so I can talk to them about it.
Generally speaking, when we're in one of these warm periods, like in the 1930s, for example, it is drier. Look at the big disaster in the Great Plains in the 1930s, the big dust storms, very dry, droughts, no doubt about it. The whole country was in a drought in the 1930s, no doubt about it. So warming does tend to promote dryness, but it's not the only thing. We now have what's called El Nino and La Nina, which are ocean distribution at the tropics, where for about 2 years, warm water will go from Peru, driven westward by the trade winds, and we have warmer climates, generally speaking, globally. And what happens when we get one of these is that oftentimes the rain that comes through Washington goes to California. California's drought is largely over. Their reservoirs are nearly full, or at least they're a lot fuller than I thought. It's snowing in the Sierra Nevada yesterday, in the middle of May. And so what happens is that it redistributes the position of the jet stream a bit, and that affects the onshore flow. So when that happens, instead of the jet stream making all kinds of loops, and the storm systems, instead of coming up through here, go straight across the country, and when they go through sometimes late New Mexico and Texas, you can get a dry year there while you're having a wet year elsewhere. So generally speaking, the answer to your question is dryness does promote, temperature does promote dryness, but there are also other factors.
Yes, Jared Barufi. We talked a little earlier about the amount of water that there is in the world and ocean acidification and what that really means and pH. Could you go into that a little bit for everybody here?
The basic idea that's being pushed in this respect is that the oceans are becoming acidic, and that's killing coral reefs, and it's going to kill oysters and clams and all kinds of sea life. And the idea is that as CO2 has gone up in the atmosphere, gone from a huge staggering amount like 81,000ths of 1%, and the contention is that the overall pH of the seawater is about 8.1, 8.2. That's sort of a global average, although it's not the same everywhere. That's alkaline. You have to get below 7 to be acid. So the oceans are not becoming acid. They may become a little bit less alkaline, but they're not acid. Nor are they ever going to be acid. For the simple reason that if you look at the total amount of water in the world, it's about 300 million cubic miles. It's a pretty big drink of water. The total change in atmospheric CO2 since 1950, which is the only time you can blame it on CO2, is about 81,000ths of 1%. How can you change the composition of the atmosphere by 81,000ths of 1% of a gas that accounts for only 3% of warming and heat up, or not heat up, and change this into the ocean water to convert 300 million cubic miles of seawater from alkaline to acid? It ain't going to happen.
Well, I'm Johnny, and it's after 8:30, and so we're going to begin to close the meeting, but I have a question partly in jest but maybe there's some truth to it. Is there any chance that the increasing land use regulation and politics that force people to live in increasingly dense, concrete-laden environments that we call big cities, is that at least as much a correlation to global warming as CO2?
Let me show you something, which is one of my big things.
Is that equally, John?
Overpopulation is really important, and let me give you a couple of examples. And this is the chart of population. You realize that when John Kennedy was president, we had half as many people as we have now in the U.S. and half as many people in the world, doubled since then. The population of the world, the population of the U.S. has been doubling every 38 years. Let's say every 40 years, just to make a point. So we've just passed more than 7 billion people. And if you look back, 1960, we had only 3 people, so it's more than double. And the question is then, what do we expect then for the next 40 years? If the same rate of population increase continues, as it has for the entire century, by 2040, we'll have 12 billion people. And if we go on to 2080, we're talking 24 billion people, as compared to 3 billion people in 1960. What are we going to do with all those people? It is well, as an example, this is called an exponential equation. It means it keeps increasing faster and faster and faster. And let me give you a concrete example. In third world countries, if a family has 10 kids, and if 2 people marry at age 15, and they have 10 kids, and then their kids marry, and each have 10 kids. And if this original couple, 2 people, live to be 90 years old, how many progeny, how many new people will they have added to the global population? What would you guess? 1 million. Yep, you're right. That's what most people say. How can it be? Because if they live to be 90 and every 15 years they have 10 kids, the math is absolutely correct that those 2 people will have generated 1 million people. But think about this. What about the next generation, the next 90 years? How much will it be? 1 million people. So what I'm saying is that the population increase is incredibly serious, and that's what we're seeing now all over the world. We're approaching what's called a critical mass. A critical mass means you've got enough people on this curve now, so that every time you double it, it gets bigger by a large amount, by a factor of 10. And so the biggest problem I think we face is not so much it's climate, it's what's going to happen to the food supply, to the power supply, to energy supply, to everything else, when we're talking about having 12 to 20 billion people on the planet. What are we going to do for water? Nobody is giving a thought to any of this. That's a crisis, because we are now getting in the range of critical mass. In an atomic bomb, critical mass means that you have enough radioactive atoms disintegrating so that it happens so fast, multiplies so fast, that you get an explosion. That's why population is called a population explosion. It's an exponential equation, and what's going to happen is it's happening now. We are approaching a critical mass.
I'd argue it's self-limiting because when you run out of food, you run out of people.
Absolutely. The problem is self-solving, and it's true that in geologic time, every species that has achieved dominance with no predators has increased until all of a sudden they disappear because they've outnumbered the food supply, and that's happening to us.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're getting ready for our close. The doctor is going to be here hanging out with us to ask him questions one-on-one. But was this a good presentation or what? Was it informative? It was a great presentation. And we welcome you back anytime, and we're going to kind of do some closing options, and if you want to ask him some questions one-on-one after the meeting, that's great.
Any chance that these PowerPoints will be posted on the site?
I understand he does have a website.
If you want to know more, if this has whetted your appetite to get some actual factual data, just go to Google or Bing and put my name in. You'll get 300,000 hits or something, but ignore that. In the first half dozen, there'll be my website. That has a lot of information on it. And in addition, I put together, I've called 10 things that everybody needs to know about global climate change, which I'm happy to send you if you just email me. And you get my email from the website. It's dbunny14@yahoo.com, and it's on the website. Easy to find.
Give him a round of applause. Just for doesn't this deserve a standing ovation? I think it deserves a standing ovation. Yeah? Give him a good one. Come on. This is Kip Staff welcome to our Bellingham experts. There we go. Thank you. Thank you. Now, again, if you enjoyed the presentation and you want to see more of these kinds of things happen between the Silverdale Seabeck Republican women, that's still way too many syllables for me, and the Kitsap Patriot Tea Party, please give generously so we can pay our bills tonight.